we're talking about something here that for a lot of people is kind of fascinating, Munchausen and Munchausen by proxy. The first question, what is the difference, you think, between Munchausen and Munchausen by proxy and medical child abuse?
Yeah, so medical child abuse describes the act, which is a criminal act, of exaggerating, inducing, or fabricating illness in your child. And when we talk about Munchausen by proxy, we actually use it to describe two things. So Munchausen by proxy is both that criminal act of medical child abuse, and we also use it to describe the underlying psychiatric disorder. The real name of that is factitious disorder imposed on another. That's what's in the DSM that psychiatrists use to diagnose things. And that's when someone engages in those behaviors for the purposes of attention and sympathy. And then Munchausen behaviors are when someone induces, fabricates, or exaggerates illness in themselves, again, for those same purposes.
And Andrea, you have a family member, as we understand here, that was investigated for Munchausen by proxy, right? But never charged, is that correct?
Yes, so my older sister was investigated, has been investigated twice for both of her two children. Once about 14 years ago, which is when my family became estranged from her over that investigation, because we believed very strongly that abuse was happening, and so she, cut us off because of that. And then another time several years ago for her younger child. In that instance, there was a 2-year-long police investigation that was referred to the prosecutor for charges. They did not file charges against her, largely, I believe, because the family court at that point had denied the state's petition for dependency, meaning that they had returned custody of her children, which, as Mike can tell you, is something that happens a lot in these cases.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that, because in a lot of these cases, Detective Weber, it's a mother, right, who's committing this or is being charged or blamed for this kind of child abuse?
Yeah, there was a literary study that looked at 796 cases of this abuse. 95.6% were the mother, 97.6% were female. Now, why that is, we don't have the literature on. Could it be, Dr. Mark Feldman will tell you that females in pretty much every society on the face of the earth are the primary medical caretakers for the children. So is it a crime of opportunity or just something specific to females? We don't know. We don't have the research.
Would you have a guess as to why?
I would not even.
I have a guess. I think it's an educated guess as well.
Because really, a lot of people are wondering why is it that we only hear of mothers being in these cases?
I have a working theory, and this was actually really underpinned by a recent conversation that I had with one of our APSAC committee colleagues, Dr. Kathy Ayub, who's a psychologist and researcher at Harvard, who looks a lot into these behaviors of pathological liars, people that really, people who are con artists, that kind of thing, and what people lie about. And I've noticed a really interesting gender divide that she had clocked as well. So when you see men engaging in these big deceptions, they lie about things like military service that they didn't really do, or they lie and pretend they're like the CEO of a company. And, I think the reason we see so many, our colleague Mike mentioned Dr. Mark Feldman always says this is a crime of opportunity, right? So number one, that's who, that's that's who's taking care of children. But also this is what women get a good response for, right? This is what women get praised for. Being good nurturers, especially, if you're the heroic mother of a sick child, that's something that people really respond to in women. And that's something that really, so I think that divide in gender roles is really likely why we see this behavior express itself with women.
It sounds like maybe it's just easier to believe a woman. When she's
in this instance, yes.
Right.
I tend to think that, I'm a mother of two myself and have been a woman on this earth for 42 years. And I think that this is really one of the only areas that we give women sort of full authority and full control is over their children. And so it makes sense if you are a person that's looking for a role to exploit, that this is the role you would choose as a woman.
Yeah. And I say all the time, the societal perception of motherhood, we do not want that disturbed as a society. We want to believe mothers are good, and we want to believe mothers are protective of their children. Sure. And you will see numerous articles on this abuse where you'll never even see the word abuse appear in the article. It's all about mom's mental health this, mom's mental health that. That is the equivalent of referring to someone who commits child sexual abuse as just using the word pedophilia. That person's pedophilia this, that person's pedophilia that.
They suffer from pedophilia.
Right.
You see a lot of terminology where they say,
suffer.
oh, this person suffers from Munchausen by
I
proxy.
have heard that, right.
Yeah.
Almost making them a victim of the condition.
Right.
Correct.
Whereas this is very clearly, and they demonstrate in interviews all the time, this is very clearly a planned and intentional behavior that they knowingly commit.
Well, such is the case, right? Hope Ybarra, right? That's a case that's covered in the book. You guys talk about it in your podcast. What's that case about?
Hope was my second case ever, the first case I filed criminal charges on. And she had presented herself as having cancer. Her entire family believes she had cancer. She'd had 2 remission parties. And she also presented her youngest daughter as having cystic fibrosis. And what came to pass after the investigation is we found out she had falsified her daughter's cystic fibrosis test. She had admitted falsifying that presumptive test. She would not admit to, when I interviewed her, about taking blood from her daughter, but later in a subsequent interview after there were no more consequences, kind of said, well, if the doctors say I did that, then I did that. And she also subsequently admitted putting pathogens into her daughter through a breathing treatment that she had stolen from work. Again, the pathogens being Pseudomonas aeruginosa and Salmonella.
And tell me again, how was it that y'all found out that that wasn't true? That she was lying about that all the time? Was it checking with doctors as well, or?
It all came down to the criminal investigation. For me, it was going back, looking at medical records, comparing histories. We retested her, the victim, for cystic fibrosis, and she did not have. The sweat test was not. The sweat test came back negative for cystic fibrosis. So you can't have it and not have it. It's a genetic condition. So we knew that the first test had to be falsified. And she then admitted to me in the interview that she had falsified the test.
I wanted to ask you about that because she tells you in the interview, right, that she's basically admitting to you that this is all a lie, that she's causing this harm to her daughter. Not being truthful about any of these conditions. When you're hearing this in the interview, when she's telling you all of this, what are you thinking now?
Well, number one, she didn't admit to everything. She minimized, and she initially denied everything. And we're talking a good hour into the interview when I, kind of hit her with some facts that she didn't know I had, where she finally makes admissions. And she only admits to the things she thinks I can prove, which is kind of the pattern I've seen with these offenders. And she never completely admits her entire course of conduct. And I don't think in her subsequent interviews with Andrea and with Deanna Boyd, I don't think she ever has admitted her entire course of conduct.
So she's never taken responsibility for it?
No.
Absolutely not.
No, and I spoke to her, a couple of years ago for the show, and the reason I was so compelled by this case in particular is that there are so many parallels with my own family story. And her family is unfortunately in the minority, as my family was, where they recognized what was happening and they acted really quickly to protect the kids. And actually it was her mother who discovered that she was lying about her cancer, and that was what kicked everything off. Right. And in my conversation with Hope, as Mike said, she minimized, she was continuing to pretend to be deaf, which I knew she wasn't. She said she didn't remember things. She said, that she had XYZ condition that caused her to not remember things. So she was very much keeping up with the charade.
So my next question goes back to what we were talking about before, why people do what they do. Is there any reason as to why folks decide to go down that path and sort of, is it actually a mental disorder? Is it fun to lie? Does it become a game? I mean, why does someone sort of stick to that for so long and go so far with it?
People like Hope, people who are actively inducing symptoms in their child and are telling fantastical lies outside of the health of their child. Like Hope said she was a PhD, she's never a PhD. She said she had cancer herself. Those type of people, I think they get some type of intrinsic thrill out of fooling people that they believe are smarter than themselves, and really get kind of some type of thrill out of the actual act of being believed when they know they're telling a lie.
Is there a mental illness component to this, though?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question. I think it sort of depends on how you classify a mental illness, right? There is a DSM diagnosis, so officially yes. Okay. However, it's really important for people to understand that no one is diagnosed with factitious disorder imposed on another outside of the context of being held criminally liable, right? So that is when people are court ordered to go and get this diagnosis. And the diagnosis is not something that you can, for example, sit down with a psychiatrist or psychologist and they can say, oh, this person has it or they don't. It's about doing an investigation to see, is this behavior happening or not? Did they harm the child or not? And it's not very treatable.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's even our sort of most optimistic colleagues on the psychiatric side will say, oh, this is, kind of a 1 in a million perpetrator that will ever take the first step of being fully accountable for their behavior. And on top of that, there are a number of personality disorders that are comorbid with this.
And
right.
it is an evidence-based diagnosis, right? So you have to go through all the evidence because these offenders don't tell the truth. So you can't rely on what they tell you as to why they do it, right? Because they are not going to tell you their motive when they're not even telling you the truth about all the other things that they've done.
It really is fascinating, and the reason I ask that question also is, and I'm sure you all have heard it as well, you tell yourself enough lies, you soon become to understand them to be real, and you believe them to be real. And I wonder if that's something that happens within cases like these.
I just from my interviews with these offenders, I absolutely believe that they know what they're doing, and they know it's wrong.
Okay.
Because they will lie initially, and then you'll get bits and pieces and some admissions, but you'll never get the entire truth because they're hiding it from you for self-protection purposes.
And our colleagues on the psychiatric side, such as Dr. Mary Sanders, who's done some work with perpetrators and is one of the people who developed sort of the treatment model, has talked about in some of her conversations with offenders that they talk about this really sort of extreme compartmentalization. So they understand what they're doing, right? And the nature of the abuse tells you that, right? They do things like Google symptoms. It's something it's a long con. It's taking place over a long period of time. So it's not something that someone's doing impulsively in a moment of stress, for example. But that I do think that there's an element where they are sort of hiding from themselves. There's some complexity, but it's not something where someone is delusional, doesn't understand, actually doesn't remember what they're doing. Like, I don't think any of that is true.
Yeah, I say all the time, denial is the strongest human emotion, but denial is not understanding what you're doing and not understanding that it's wrong when you're doing it. They should be criminally culpable.
How is Hope's daughter doing now? Do we know?
She's doing great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this story is as big of a success story as you're going to see in one of these cases because the intervention was successful. Hope's children were still relatively young when it happened, so certainly they suffered a great trauma, this whole situation, but they were raised by a loving, protective father. They have a close-knit family, and so yeah, as far as we know, she's doing really well. I believe she's still in college at the moment.
Okay, and thriving, sounds like.
Yeah.
I didn't ask you this. I'm assuming Hope she's in prison.
Nope. She is out of prison. When I talked to her, she had been pretty recently released.
Okay.
So she is living in Idaho still, and that's about all I know.
Do you know if she has a relationship with her daughter now, or how
No.
is she trying to?
I think it's important to say that Hope pled guilty. So she went up in front of a judge, said she was guilty because she is guilty, and she received a 10-year prison sentence. She served every day of that 10-year prison sentence. Okay. And no, she does not have a relationship with her children at this point.
Yeah, I believe she's still in contact with her sister, Robin, who I am friends with and got to know when I was making the show, and I've spoken to recently. So I think Robin is the only person in the family, I believe, who sort of keeps tabs on Hope.
And Andrea, I want to follow up here and talk a little bit more about the family because, like you said, you have a similar case in your family. When these lies are being told, when these fabrications are taking place and really sort of gaining its wheels, if so to speak, what role do other parents or grandparents or other relatives play in all of this?
They are the most important people, and if you have a divide in the family, as we did in my family, where unfortunately, because of previous events in my family, one of the most notable being that my sister had faked a twin pregnancy. Another really uncanny similarity with the Hope Ybarra case. Hope did the same thing. It was two girls. Also, she lost it at the same time that in the pregnancy that my sister said she lost it. And so that had happened before my nephew was born. And so we had this long history of this deceptive behavior on my sister to sort of that clued us into what was happening with my nephew. And unfortunately, we could not get my sister's husband, Andy, to listen to us. His family would not listen to us. They thought we were the enemy. And my sister and many other of the women in these cases are extremely adept at turning people against each other. So you get into this very nasty us versus them dynamic pretty fast. And so in Hope's case, fortunately, and there was, of course, this is a hugely traumatic thing for the people in the family to go through, right? To realize this person that you love is not who you thought they were, that they've been, there's a huge amount of betrayal trauma, right? When you realize you have been believing that, in Hope's case, that she had cancer or that their child was sick. And when you realize all those lies, that's a horrible thing. But it's really important for people to work through that as fast as they can and prioritize the children, which happened in Hope's case.
Andrew, touch on that a little bit more, because I think it's important for people to really realize the kind of effect that this has on relatives and other family members, right? I mean, once all of the judicial part of it is over, like you said in your case, I mean, you're still estranged from your sister. I mean, this is a big hit to the family unit, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's devastating for families. And in our case, we, because we refused to go along with my sister Megan's version of reality, and because my parents refused to finance a lawsuit against the children's hospital that reported her, we have not gotten to be in my nephew and then my niece's life. So we got completely cut out. And also the entities that attempted to protect my niece and nephew were unsuccessful. And so that really was devastating for us. We thought, oh, wow, we've blown our family apart and the children weren't protected. So yeah, I mean, it is really traumatic. And I would say to any adult that's in this situation, do not put your own comfort of believing what you want to believe over the safety of the children, because if you continue to support that narrative, you are then also culpable for abuse. And it's a very hard thing to come around on, but if you don't and you continue to enable it, then you are enabling a child to be harmed. And that's never okay, despite how much I empathize with what people go through when they find this out.
Sure.
And a supportive father who understands that this is abuse is really important to have in these cases. Unfortunately, they are pretty consistently treated pretty terribly by the criminal justice system and family court, who will continue to believe the mother a lot of the times. Not all the time, but a lot of the times. And
you would think with medical records, I mean, you could squash this real quickly, soon. I mean, you would think, right? I mean,
if the courts listened to doctors, yes, that would be true.
Because someone would say, okay, you don't believe
don't.
this, and there's some doubt about what they're claiming. Let's see what the doctor says, right?
Yeah.
Are the doctors getting fooled too, or what's? Is it HIPAA? Is that what it is? Is it?
No. So doctors can easily be fooled in this, because these offenders pick conditions that are not easily medically tested for and rely on the history given by the caregiver for a medical diagnosis. That's why we see the same thing. That's why we often see feeding tubes in these. We see seizure disorder. We see all of these things that are very hard to medically test for and to determine black and white whether you have the condition or you don't. And that's why history is so important to doctors on this. But once doctors actually do this and report, then it's up to CPS, police, to do their jobs and investigate, and family court judges to do their jobs. The problem is you have 20,000 pages of medical records. Family court is not going to hold a 3-week hearing on this. They are not going to do that in order to determine the safety of the child. I have never seen that done in Tarrant County.
Well, and I can say, you know, from my experience in the second investigation, which was the really lengthy one, you know, they subpoenaed 73,000 pages of medical records for my then 5-year-old niece. They were reviewed by Dr. Carol Jenny, who's one of the top experts on this abuse, probably in the world, definitely in the country, who found positive findings of abuse. My sister at that point had been reported by 4 separate hospitals, and the family court dismissed all of that and returned her kids. So it's like there are so many different points of failure, and it really, like, the courts can
like
sort of ignore everything.
Maybe it's a blind spot that exists that people just don't know about, right?
The last 2 articles in the Juvenile and Family Court Journal on this abuse were in 1990. So they are extremely uneducated. We've done some work in Tarrant County. I'll give them a little bit of grace. They're getting a ton better on this abuse, but family court judges are just lost on this. They don't know what to do, so they kind of just throw up their hands and say, give the kids back, because the mandate in most states is parental reunification.
There's a Texas House bill, right, that plays into all of this here, 1984. Tell me about that and how that could potentially sort of help in all of this.
Yeah, Texas House Bill 1984 would make it a third-degree felony for a caregiver to intentionally or knowingly, keywords, provide a false medical history to a medical provider in order to get a medical intervention that causes mental impairment or bodily injury. And if you think about it, I don't understand why that would be so controversial. I mean, that's a high standard to meet as far as intentional or knowingly. And, you know, it's funny, in this state, it is a crime for you to go to a doctor and lie to get medication. It is it's not a crime for you to go to a doctor and lie to get medication for your children.
How many, and obviously, you know, you talk about Hope's case and the cases that you have seen, Detective, as a professional investigating these, but how often do you think this stuff is going on? It's just not being reported.
Oh, far more than what people realize. And, you know, when you see this described in the media, it often is described as extremely rare. That is, no professional I've talked to who's familiar with this believes that.
You're saying it's not that rare?
No. And I think there's
a study out of Seattle Children's. They looked at 140 some odd cases, possible cases of this abuse. They were able to confirm 65 cases over a 5-year period, another 37 they couldn't tell one way or the other, and that's with no police investigation. There's so much police can do on these cases if they choose to. But you're talking about an overburdened police workforce that's looking at it, something they don't really understand, and they're looking at a 6-month investigation. Are they going to take that on?
But the results of that study he's talking about, they found that it was about, it was like 2/3 as common as abusive head trauma, which is the most common form of child abuse. So I think that's an interesting data point, and that's a very recent data point. And anecdotally, from the other experts that we know, Mike and I are on this APSAC committee, and from my experience of having the show, which has a large listenership, I hear from people every day who are survivors, who have seen a case professionally, who know someone who sees something suspicious on Facebook that they send me, and my anecdotal experience is that there's no way it's as rare as what we're often told.
And I'm guessing, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm guessing there's different sort of degrees of it, right? So it can sort of hide.
Yeah, like all child abuse.
Or it can be masked like something else, right?
Right, and in Tarrant County, since March of 19, I've filed cases on 12 different offenders. So that gives you another indication. And those are the ones that rise to the criminal level, right? Because a lot of these cases, they don't rise to the criminal level. I had a case where she was falsifying cystic fibrosis, but nothing was ever done to the child, so there's nothing I can do. That's a CPS issue, because I have no injury to the child.
Again, and that speaks to the degrees in which this can be carried out. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and certainly it's worth pointing out that it's all damaging. I think a lot of the coverage of these cases, and certainly the ones that Mike and I are talking to, and the ones that end up on Mike's desk, you're talking about some kind of physical injury, but the psychological, emotional, educational abuse, these children are almost always pulled out of school for long periods of time. It's all really damaging. So it's worth recognizing sort of the whole piece. But certainly there is a spectrum of the abuse.
I told you I can speak about, or I can ask all day long, but we'll leave it with that, because I think that's a good closing point. So thank you both for coming in to chat with us about this.
Thank you for having us.
And good luck with all your work going forward with this.
Thank you.
Thank you.